He stopped her for no reason. He accused her of lying, but when he tried to control, he learned a lesson for life. She was someone he shouldn't have messed with, but it was too late. The afternoon in New Orleans had a light all its own, not the blinding kind of the West, nor the gray stillness of the North. It was a golden warmth, stretched like a thin blanket across old stone steps, faded shutters, and porches still strung with wind chimes. Callista Monroe walked slowly down the familiar street, every step brushing against a memory layered beneath the dust of time. It had been more than 10 years, but it felt like the neighborhood had simply paused, waiting, waiting for someone, perhaps her. She carried a tan duffel bag over her shoulder, frayed at the edges, worn soft by years in places most people only knew through war documentaries. She wasn't in uniform today, just a fitted tee, cargo pants, and well-worn sneakers. But something about the way she moved, shoulders square, steps measured, head steady still, spoke of command, of control, not loud, just certain. No one knew she was back. No friends waiting on the porch. No family waving from the doorway. She didn't want any of that. This wasn't a return. It was a quiet reckoning, a search for the pieces of herself she left behind in the spaces between deployment orders and folded flags. She passed the old barber shop, the sign still hanging crooked like always. Hand-painted letters peeling with pride. The metal chairs were still out front, rusted but loyal. A basketball thudded in the distance. Kids yelled across the court like their lives depended on the next shot. And from a second-story balcony, a saxophone wandered through the air like it had nowhere else to be. It should have felt like home, but it didn't. Maybe it was the absence. The one person who could have made it feel like something more than memory. Her mother wasn't here anymore. Callista stopped outside a small green-shuttered house. Lavender used to line the front steps, planted by hands that taught her how to be gentle in a world that demanded armor. Now the fence leaned to one side and the potted plants were brown with thirst. She didn't go in. She just stood there, breathing it in. The scent of old wood, fried catfish from the corner, a trace of honeysuckle from a neighbor's yard. She wanted to believe that some part of her mother was still present in the soil, in the porch swing, in the silence. She hadn't been able to come back after the funeral. 3 days of emergency leave hadn't been enough. Not to grieve, not to say goodbye, not to make peace with the guilt of being late, of being away. Duty had called her back before her tears had dried. Now she had time, but no one left to share it with. A breeze moved through the street, catching the small charm bracelet on her wrist, her mother's last gift. Callista glanced upward. The light was shifting, deepening into amber. Time to keep walking. She adjusted the strap of her duffel. It wasn't heavy, not in weight, but in memory. Everything inside it carried a piece of her from the battlefield, from the decisions that still echoed in her sleep, and the friendships that never made it home. She didn't know what she was walking toward, but she knew one thing for certain. This homecoming would ask more of her courage than any battlefield ever had. And somehow, she was ready. Callista turned onto Claymore Street, a narrow stretch that curved past the community park and into the heart of the neighborhood. The pavement was cracked, the buildings freshly painted but still carrying the quiet exhaustion of time. The world here had been dressed up, but the cracks hadn't truly healed, only hidden. She walked steadily, not in a hurry, not trying to stand out. Yet somehow she always did. People looked twice, not because of what she wore, but because of the way she carried herself. That unmistakable stillness, the calm of someone who didn't need to explain herself to anyone. The kind of presence that didn't ask for space. It simply was. Behind her, a patrol car rolled up slow, deliberate. It didn't honk, didn't speed past. It followed. Callista knew that rhythm, the slow crawl of suspicion, the way silence could feel heavier than sirens. The car stopped beside her. The window slid down with mechanical ease. "Ma'am," a voice called out, measured dry. "Mind telling me what you're doing in this neighborhood?" She turned her head slightly. A white police officer, mid-40s, tight crew cut, mirrored sunglasses that made it impossible to read his eyes. But she didn't need to. His tone said everything. Officer David Kirkland. His voice wasn't aggressive, not yet, but it held something that slow burn of authority looking for a reason. "I'm walking," she replied evenly. "Going home." David tilted his head, like he couldn't quite process the idea. "Home, huh?" he echoed. "Where exactly is home?" Callista shifted the weight of her bag. "Delacroix Street, just past the park." A pause, then the inevitable. "Do you have ID on you?" She didn't flinch. "Didn't think I needed one to walk through the place I grew up." The smirk on his lips faded slightly, but not the entitlement in his posture. It wasn't her tone that bothered him. It was the way she didn't shrink. "Couple of break-ins reported around here," he said flatly. "Just making sure everything's in order." There it was, the thin justification wrapped in vague concern. Not an accusation, but a test. He wanted to see how she'd react. "Do I look like I'm breaking into something?" she asked calmly. David didn't answer. He just leaned a little closer against the car door, the fabric of his uniform taut across his arm. Callista saw it, the slight twitch in his jaw, the shift in his stance. It wasn't about her answers. It was about control slipping through his fingers, and she wasn't giving it back. "Let me see some ID," he said again, this time with less patience. Callista didn't move right away. She had learned long ago that stillness could be its own form of power. She assessed everything: the angle of his car, the position of his holster, the distance to the sidewalk, and the growing presence of bystanders nearby. Her training wasn't something she ever switched off. It lived in her bones, in her breath. Then slowly she reached into her pocket. Her hands moved in full view, deliberate and calm. She pulled out her military ID and held it up, not handing it over, just letting him see. David leaned forward. He squinted. "Military, huh?" His voice flattened. Callista had seen it before. That flash in the eyes of someone who couldn't quite reconcile the image in front of them with what they believed possible. His lips curled slightly. "You walk like you've done something important." She said nothing. And in that nothingness, the power began to shift. Because now it wasn't just her and him anymore. A delivery driver had stopped across the street. Two teenage boys on bikes were watching from the corner. A woman with a tote bag had paused mid-step, one hand on her phone, camera raised, recording. Callista didn't look away. Neither did they. And for the first time since he'd rolled down his window, David Kirkland was the one being watched. Callista held up her military ID at a slight distance, not close enough for him to grab, but clear enough for him to read. It was a small gesture, but deliberate. Control didn't always need to be loud. Sometimes it lived in posture, in stillness, in restraint. David reached for the card anyway, not aggressively, not even roughly, but without permission, and that in itself was the problem. Callista had seen it countless times before. Men like him who assumed authority meant access, and uniform meant ownership. She didn't flinch, but her body reacted before her mind gave it permission. A quiet shift of her wrist, a slight rotation of her forearm barely perceptible, yet enough to throw him off balance. Not a strike, not resistance, just precision, control, intention. David stumbled half a step. It wasn't dramatic, but it was enough. Enough for the crowd to notice. Enough to shatter the illusion of dominance he had been clinging to. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Someone whispered, "Did you see that?" Another held their phone higher, camera focused, hands steady, and suddenly the narrative shifted. This wasn't a routine stop anymore. It was a scene, a reckoning. David's face flushed, not with pain but with something far worse, humiliation. Callista didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply remained still, her eyes steady and unreadable. "You're interfering with a police officer," he said, voice sharper now, as if volume might restore what posture had just lost. Callista responded with silence. Her calm was unnerving. The way she stood there composed, unwavering, made his badge look smaller by the second. The crowd had grown. A few people had crossed the street. No one spoke, but everyone watched. And David started to feel it. The shift, not in the law, not in his authority, but in the weight of being seen. "You think this is a game?" he snapped. Callista tilted her head slightly like she was studying a puzzle she'd already solved. "Do I look like I'm laughing?" Her tone wasn't sarcastic. It was sincere. And that sincerity cut deeper than mockery ever could. His hand twitched toward his radio. She noticed. "Dispatch, I need backup," he said, voice tight. Callista stepped forward, not confrontational, but firm, grounded. "For what?" she asked. "Because I didn't shrink?" That question, so quiet, so centered, hung in the air like a verdict. "You're being uncooperative," David barked, louder now, as if trying to convince himself more than her. From the edge of the crowd, a woman spoke up. "You're the only one raising your voice." That single sentence tore through the tension like a blade. David's jaw clenched. His breath quickened. Callista recognized the look a man cornered, not by force, but by truth. And truth, when seen by too many, becomes inescapable. "Turn around," he ordered, pulling out his handcuffs. "Hands behind your back." Callista inhaled slowly, not in fear, in clarity. She had three choices. Let him cuff her for nothing, run and feed his narrative, or stop this, right here, before it spiraled into something that couldn't be undone. She chose the third. "If you cuff me," she said, voice low, even, calm, "you're going to regret it." His laugh was short, bitter. "Is that a threat?" "No," she replied without blinking. "It's a fact." But David had already made his decision. He lunged forward, and that was his last mistake. Before his fingers touched the cuffs, Callista moved, not violently, not recklessly, but with the grace of someone trained to end conflict without starting a war. One pivot, one shift of weight, one redirection of energy, and suddenly David was off balance, arms flailing, the cuffs slipping from his grip. To the crowd, it looked like he tripped over his own pride. Someone laughed. Someone else whispered, "She didn't even touch him." Callista stood still, breathing evenly, eyes calm, like none of it surprised her, because it didn't. Power, she knew, wasn't about dominance. It was about knowing exactly when to let someone fall on their own. A camera clicked, then another. The street didn't roar. It listened. Callista stood still, her arms loose by her sides, breathing steady. In front of her, Officer David Kirkland looked like a man unraveling, bit by bit, not from violence, but from something far more terrifying: being seen. Across the street, a delivery worker had stopped. A teenager on a bike paused mid-turn. A woman with a grocery bag stood unmoving, phone raised, expression flat. No one shouted, no one interfered, but no one looked away. and that was worse than a crowd screaming. David shifted his weight, suddenly aware of how exposed he was, not physically but morally. His posture stiffened, his jaw clenched. He glanced at the cameras, the quiet witnesses, and his face betrayed it all. He was no longer in control. Another patrol car rolled up, lights off, engine quiet. The door opened slowly. Out stepped Sergeant Robert Gaines Tall, seasoned, calm like a thunderstorm just before it breaks. He didn't ask for explanations. He didn't demand order. He just scanned the scene once and understood more than words could say. "Officer Kirkland," he called, voice neutral. "What's going on here?" David turned quickly, tone defensive before he could stop himself. "She refused to cooperate, gave me attitude, wouldn't comply when I asked for ID. I was doing my job." His voice lacked the conviction it had minutes earlier. Robert looked at Callista. She said nothing. Just handed over her military ID again. No words, no drama. He read the name, paused, read it again. "Lieutenant Monroe?" he asked, this time with weight. Silence fell heavy. David froze. Robert's tone shifted, now sharp as glass. "Did you know that, officer?" David opened his mouth and then closed it. I didn't read the ID or didn't expect someone like her to hold that title." The question wasn't for an answer. It was a scalpel meant to cut into truth. The crowd murmured, energy rising not in chaos, but in awakening. Callista stood unflinching. She didn't need to defend herself. The moment was doing it for her. Robert turned to her, his voice soft but firm. "Do you wish to file a complaint, Lieutenant?" All eyes shifted. David barely breathed. His career, his image, his pride, all hung in the balance. Callista looked at him. A man who just minutes ago tried to claim ownership over her presence, now reduced to nothing but silence. She let a beat pass, then another, and then calmly, "No, there's no need." Robert blinked. "Are you sure?" She nodded once. "He's already learned what he needed to." Her words landed heavier than handcuffs. From the edge of the sidewalk, someone clapped. Just once, not out of celebration, but recognition. The phones began to lower. The energy shifted again, from tension to reflection, from fury to respect. David didn't move. Couldn't. Robert turned back toward him, voice clipped with finality. "You're relieved of duty, effective immediately." Gasps. David's lips parted, hands shaking. "You can't be serious." Robert cut him off. "I suggest you stop talking. For your own sake." The message was clear. This was over, and he had lost. Not just the moment, but the image he had built of himself. Callista said nothing more. She didn't need to, because sometimes the loudest justice is served when the world is watching, and you choose not to strike, but to stand. The crowd hadn't left not out of curiosity, but out of something more profound. They had witnessed something rare, authority being unraveled without violence, and dignity being reclaimed without rage. Callista remained still, arms relaxed, gaze steady. The chaos had passed, but the weight of what had just happened lingered in the warm air, like dust after impact. Sergeant Robert Gaines turned toward her, calm but cautious. "Lieutenant, do you still wish not to press charges?" Callista looked at David Kirkland, the officer now standing in the ruins of his pride. He wasn't arguing anymore. He wasn't posturing. His eyes were lowered, hands clenched by his sides, like a man trying to hold together what little self-respect he had left. She stepped toward him, not close enough to intimidate, but close enough to be heard and felt. "I used to think that if this ever happened to me," she said quietly, "I'd follow protocol, file a report, make sure justice was done on paper. She paused. But now that I'm here, I realize some lessons don't need courts. They just need witnesses. David raised his eyes slightly, red-rimmed, confused, embarrassed. You're not afraid of me? He asked, the question slipping out like a confession. Callista exhaled slowly. I'm not afraid of anyone, but I also don't need anyone to be afraid of me to know I'm strong. The crowd grew silent again, not out of tension this time, but reverence. She turned to Robert and shook her head. No charges, not because he deserves mercy, but because I deserve peace. That was her justice. Robert gave a quiet nod, not in approval, but in respect. Behind them, David swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. You didn't have to be this kind. Callista looked at him, steady, unwavering. It's not kindness. It's a decision. I'm not carrying anger that belongs to you. Then she walked away. No celebration, no applause. Just a shift in the air, as if the entire street understood what had just happened. She hadn't walked away from a fight. She had ended one without ever throwing a punch. At the edge of the sidewalk, a teenager jogged up beside her, nervous, wide-eyed. Were you really in the military? Callista glanced at him, nodded. Yeah, you're really strong, he said, almost in awe. She smiled, soft but certain. Strength isn't about winning. It's about knowing who you are and not letting anyone take that away from you. The boy stood taller after that. Callista kept walking, not with triumph, but with something far greater peace that comes from knowing you didn't become what tried to break you. The sun had softened into amber, spilling across the porch steps of the house Callista once called home. The air was still, as if the entire neighborhood had exhaled with her. She sat quietly, leaning against a weathered wooden column. Her legs pulled close, arms resting gently, body unmoving, but not tense, just present. No phones, no uniform, no one asking questions. Just space, just silence, just enough room to be. Behind her, the screen door creaked open. She didn't need to turn around. You always sit like that when you're thinking, Rick said, her uncle, the last family she had left in this city. His voice was rough around the edges, softened by years of knowing when to speak and when not to. He settled beside her on the porch, placing 2 cold teas on the floor. The moment held. No rush. No need to fill it. I thought I'd be used to it by now, Callista murmured. Being questioned, being doubted, being treated like I don't belong. But every time it happens, it still cuts. Rick nodded slowly, staring into the street. It hurts because you still feel. And if you can still feel, you're still human. She didn't respond right away, just stared ahead at the rusted gate, the overgrown lavender her mother once planted, now a quiet mess of stems and memory. I didn't come back to make a point, she said. I just wanted to walk in peace. And you did, Rick replied, sipping his tea. And you showed everyone what peace looks like when it refuses to bow. Callista looked down at her wrist, the faded fabric bracelet tied years ago by a fellow soldier who never came home. She touched it gently, like a promise she hadn't forgotten. I'm still angry, she admitted, not at David, at the system, at the fact that no matter what I've done, how I've served, I still have to prove I'm not a threat just for being here. Rick didn't argue. He let the words settle, let the weight of them have space. Then he leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You're asking the wrong question, kid, he said. She turned slightly, brows furrowed. The question isn't, will it change everything? Rick continued. The question is, will it change something? Callista let that sit in her chest. It didn't remove the ache, but it made room for it. And in that room there was clarity. Maybe that boy who watched today will remember he doesn't have to shrink. Maybe that woman filming will realize her voice matters. Maybe even David will take a long, hard look in the mirror. She didn't know, but maybe was enough. Rick nudged her shoulder gently. So what now? Callista smiled softly, setting her tea down. I keep walking. He chuckled, quiet and full of pride. That's my girl. Sometimes the fight isn't about battles. It's about refusing to disappear. And sometimes all it takes to shift the world is someone who refuses to be moved. Not everyone in uniform is respected, and not everyone with a badge deserves power. Callista came home after years of serving her country, not for applause, not for glory, just to walk down the streets that raised her. But what she met was suspicion, prejudice, another moment where she had to prove her worth. Again, this story isn't about winning a confrontation, it's about winning yourself. Choosing not to let anger define you, refusing to let injustice reshape your spirit. Callista didn't fight back with fists. She stood her ground with dignity, presence, and restraint. She forgave not because he earned it, but because she deserved peace. You may not be able to change the whole system, but if you have the courage to stand tall, to hold your space, to keep your voice steady when they want you silent, then you've already changed something. And sometimes changing one moment is enough to shake the entire narrative. Because real strength isn't loud. It doesn't scream for attention. It simply refuses to disappear.